Shashi, thank you for writing this book.
Thank you,
I would highly recommend it. It's slim, but it's taut, but it's full of terrific insights. So if you want to understand this mysterious giant from India's independence movement and then post-independence India as well, you must read the book. I say mysterious giant because he was a man who's very difficult, extremely difficult to capture in words and adjectives because A, he was just too many things. He was a political revolutionary, at the same time a political maverick, intellectual colossus, jurist, economist, Dalit activist against caste discrimination. An extraordinary person, very difficult to describe and capture, and only someone with Shashi's abilities could do that in this very taut biography. So I just also want to draw, and it's not facetious, but I just want to draw a very thin line between Dr. Ambedkar and Shashi. All his political life, Dr. Ambedkar was looked upon as an outsider and a maverick by the Congress party. And I understand that Shashi, of late, is also being looked upon as a maverick. Is that right, Shashi?
I think if I end up with even a fraction of Dr. Ambedkar's achievements and the legacy he has left behind, I'll be very, very happy. But I mean, I must say that an ability to think for oneself, if that's what defines a maverick in our politics, I plead guilty as charged.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to start, Shashi, with a bit of, if you will permit me, a bit of magic realism. Now imagine that Dr. Ambedkar is in the prime of his life, political life, and he is alive today in that prime.
Oh.
So, yes, so the India of today, where a lot of things have changed from the 1940s. We're a stronger country, we're a richer country. Discrimination exists against Dalits, but it's nowhere near what it was when Dr. Ambedkar was in the prime of his life. Now, if he was alive and active today, what do you think would he be? Would he be just someone who was, a big social media activist? Would he be a tenure professor at Columbia University?
No, I think he'd be in India. I mean, to begin with, unlike Mahatma Gandhi, who had this habit of expressing himself so pithily that he was like born for the Twitter era, As I said yesterday, work is worship, my life is my message. Mahatma Gandhi had all these quick one-liners, which summarized oceans of knowledge, whereas Ambedkar was somebody who expressed himself somewhat more expansively. So I don't think social media would have been his platform very much. But I do think I see him as a kind of Rajya Sabha MP, this wise statesman, but also somebody with the freedom to speak out. He wasn't, unfortunately, very successful at winning elections.
That's right.
And that's why he would have needed, I think, some friendly parties to recognize his qualities to put him in the Rajya Sabha. It would not probably have been that easy for him to come into the Lok Sabha, as he discovered in the later years.
Yeah, he lost, what, 2 elections?
Yeah, actually, he lost pretty much every election, but the one that he first won in the 30s. Now, the thing about Ambedkar also is that he saw strong entrenched views. I think he would have been absolutely appalled by the majoritarianism that prevails in ruling circles in India today. He warned against it repeatedly in the 40s and 50s, so he would see in many ways his worst fears coming true. He talked about how in democracy you have to respect a political majority, not a communal majority. And he would feel that what we have today is a communal majority. Similarly, I think he would have been appalled by the level of personality cult around the Prime Minister and other figures. Right. He had famously said that bhakti in politics is the worst thing, that you mustn't just leave it to a great man. In fact, he says that this country is full of statues to great men, and it's also full of wretchedness.
Ironically, he's now the most statued person in India.
Now he is exactly, probably there are more statues to him than any other Indian, barring Mahatma Gandhi, and even that's debatable, because somebody was saying there isn't a village in India without a statue of Dr. Ambedkar today.
Strange, isn't it?
It's remarkable because I think at the time that he died, no one would have foreseen that.
Yes.
He had been a contentious figure, a controversial figure in his lifetime, and though he had a huge amount of popular adulation and following, particularly amongst the Dalit community, he had his critics in other communities and other parties, and as I said, he rarely had the political clout to win elections and to become a political force that way.
Even among Dalits, Shashi, he was often seen as a leader of a sect, the Mahars, and not quite a pan-Dalit political leader. So what has happened in these 80 years that for someone who was politically not successful has today become possibly politically the most influential figure in Indian politics?
Yeah, no, he's politically the most influential, undoubtedly. And when you think in terms of those who tried to confine him to being a Mahar leader, I think that was always a contentious thing, because if you look at him from the late 1920s onwards, he always spoke for the larger Dalit cause in every national and international forum available to him, the roundtable conferences in London, various legislative assemblies and bodies, and finally the Constituent Assembly as well. So I would still say that he had rapidly become, from a very young age, the principal voice of the Dalit community in India. There were other Dalit leaders, and certainly Dalit leaders in the south, some of whom did not agree with Dr. Ambedkar's tactics and so on. Dalit leaders in the north, Jagjeevan Ram was the first Dalit member of the cabinet and the interim government in 1946. So you had other leaders. But because of, I think, Dr. Ambedkar's intellectual contributions, he was always larger than his particular subcaste. Now, having said that, he was a controversial figure, let's not doubt that. And he had his critics, including those who deplored the fact that he so-called collaborated with the British. His own view was that you cannot fight for the freedom of India if it means the freedom of the upper caste to continue to oppress Dalits. And therefore, if he could work with the British to ensure rights for the Dalit community, he was prepared to do that because that was important to him.
Which is why people like Arun Shourie have called him a false god.
So Arun Shouri's sort of 770-page Philippic, which honestly is the longest pamphlet ever written, I think. It really reads like a pamphlet against him. It's not, to my mind, one of Arun's better books. He's a fine writer and an intellect, but on this one, he really keeps flogging the same dead horse over and over again. Yes, Ambedkar did work with the British. He didn't go to jail as a nationalist, though he had very intelligent nationalist critiques, by the way. His critique of British financial policy, the British manipulation of the rupee, the exchange rate of the rupee was manipulated by the British entirely to favor British manufacturing interests. All of these things, Ambedkar was an ace nationalist analyst of the Indian economy. And his early books on the Indian economy are unrivaled. Yes. The problem of the rupee, provincial taxation in India, all of these things, fabulously original economic writing. So you can't call him, you can't say he wasn't a nationalist in terms of his thinking, but the kind of nationalism that we all associate with the freedom struggle, he kept one step removed from it, because he said for him, the first and most urgent challenge is to liberate, as it were, the Dalit community from their privations, because an independence without that happening would not be helpful to him. But I would want to take this further, Raghav, if I may, and say that if you look at his contributions, one has to go beyond the question of the Dalit community. That was very important in many ways. It defines him. But look what he did in his craftsmanship of the Constitution. I mean, it's striking. Yes, there was already a template in the 1935 Government of India Act. And yes, there were some very fine legal luminaries, Brahmins all, like Sir B.N. Rao and Gopalaswamy Iyengar and so on, who worked on drafts earlier. But in the drafting committee, of which there were 7 members, as T.T. Krishnamachari said in the Constituent Assembly, I think 2 had died and were never replaced. 1 was away on America and duty the entire time of the Constituent Assembly. Somebody else had some other mission. Somebody was sick and in bed. Basically, Ambedkar was it. He's the one who gave the final shape. He had to approve the final version of every article. He had to explain it and defend it before the Constituent Assembly. So to deny that his shape, the shape he gave the Constitution, was the most important is to deny a blatant and obvious fact. And some people try to deny it. And in that process, he's the one, for example, who took a country that the British had ruled on the basis of communities, of communal divides, and converted it into one where the individual has agency, where the individual citizen has rights. That was a major contribution. He brought in a number of ideas reflecting his own social suffering of injustice. The idea of fraternity, which he kept insisting upon, that we are all equal citizens, we are all brothers and sisters in this country as one. We cannot accept social gradations and differences between us. That was an Ambedkar contribution. The affirmative action program, the world's first and farthest reaching affirmative action program for scheduled castes and tribes. That was another Ambedkar achievement. So when you look at all of this, it's really quite astonishing.
Undeniable that this was a person the likes of which you don't see too easily. But there were certain flaws, and you've written about those flaws. Now, I'll pick up the point of constitutionalism, and I'll come to the other flaws later. Now, two things here. One, when it came to the adivasis, someone who practiced and preached equality and liberty of individuals all his life actually called them savages and said they should be virtually disinherited from their rights. They should be put in secluded settlements. How do you square that?
So look, I mean, every human being has flaws. And I wasn't writing a hagiography. I was writing about a human being. And frankly, when you read Ambedkar on himself, you are struck by his humanity. You read about his own experiences as a child, as family. So I see him as a human being first and foremost. And as a human being, he undoubtedly had flaws, and some of those flaws don't stand very well the test of time. And the attitude to the Adivasis is definitely one of those, because I do believe that he spoke of them with a kind of contempt that in some ways eerily sort of echoes the contempt that upper caste Hindus might be expressing towards Dalits. So
that's right.
It's very strange that he used that kind of language. And he saw them as primitive savages. He almost seemed to be recommending, South African apartheid-style Bantustans for them to be confined to. Yeah. He seemed to think they needed tutelage, that they couldn't really be helped. And he was quite unapologetic in defending the stance he took about them, which is difficult to understand. So you're right. He speaks about equality. He speaks about the need to uplift every community. But I would say that on the Adivasis, his position doesn't do him a lot of credit. But, as I said, no one's perfect.
Yeah, everyone has flaws. But I'll come to another flaw. Again, in the light of the fact that he was such a constitutionalist. Now, his belief in state power is something that I find, again, difficult to square. Here is a man who has spoken about equality of the individual. And then he says, an all-powerful state is needed because that only can deliver. And then in the same breath, he goes on to say that if this state power goes into the hands of a very popular leader, then you are staring at authoritarianism. These are three contradictory things.
Yeah. Well, on the statism, which I also deplore, and I've done so in the book, it's partly, I think, due to his belief that if you leave democracy to Hindu society, it will involve caste oppression. And therefore, he wanted a state that would be able to ride roughshod over the deep-rooted prejudices and discrimination that he saw entrenched in traditional village India. So, for example, when Mahatma Gandhi extolled village Raj, Ambedkar was totally against it. He essentially said the villages are dens of iniquity, they're sinkholes of prejudice and casteism and oppression. The villages have to be overridden by a strong, powerful central state. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that he also had a kind of centralist, we haven't discussed it in great detail, I mentioned it in the book, he had this kind of Marxist view that the economy should be in the control of the state as well, which was rapidly dismissed by the others. I mean, not even the socialists in the Constituent Assembly were prepared to go as far as he was. But this statism was part of his approach that I think was somewhat troubling. On top of which you have this question of what Ambedkar actually thought of the role of the state. He wanted to have sort of the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-wise, sort of suited-booted big shots in Delhi, pulling India out of ignorance and slavery and prejudice and so on. And that seemed a slightly patronizing attitude for a man like him to take. But again, part of the imperfection is that it comes out of the best intentions. He felt, very much like other thinkers of that time, like Dr. Mahalanobis and the Planning Commission and so on, that we know best what's good for the poor and the benighted, and we will pull them out of poverty if you just give us a free hand to have these top-down directives. Obviously, that ages very badly. And today you look at it and say, my gosh, in an era where we want more decentralization, more empowerment at the grassroots, how would his attitude have played?
I'm quite amazed that a person who learned his economics at Columbia University was so much in favor of state power. I mean, Columbia is the other end of the spectrum.
No, but he was a man who was interested in social change, rather.
Yeah.
So though, yes, he had spent years in the West, don't forget this was, first of all, a West that was busy enslaving us. And don't forget also that what he was studying there was taking a good look at his own country,
Yes.
which was then under British rule, and seeing the conditions of our country from that perspective. Secondly, as far as his own study of economics was concerned, it was very much a macro thing.
Yes.
He wasn't really looking at, for example, the problems of business people and so on.
Yeah.
And you have to understand it's a different it's a scholar's
and a colonial economy,
I think that's
and a
right.
colonial
And it was a colonial
macroeconomic
economy.
setup. Yes, I turn to now one of the major flaws that again you've talked about 4 flaws. We've already talked about 2 of them, but I'll come to the other 2 which we haven't yet spoken about. And this is, of course, you've touched upon it. His attitude, his description of Hinduism.
Yeah.
It was visceral. I think he hated Hinduism. He hated Hindus, and he didn't mince words saying that. I mean, some of the things Hindus are a race of pygmies, dwarfs. A good Hindu there cannot be, I'm quoting him.
There may be a better Hindu or a worse Hindu,
But a good Hindu
there
cannot be. Hinduism is a menace to liberty, equality, and fraternity. It's incompatible with democracy. That's what he said. Now, I want to understand, in your assessment and research into the person, was he really so violently opposed to Hinduism at a sort of pathological level that no, there cannot really be a good Hindu? Did he mean that? Or was his construction and understanding of Hinduism based on just one deep flaw in the religion, which is the sanction to the discrimination against Dalits?
Yeah, so he I think, for him, his experience of Hinduism was of oppression, was of discrimination, was a denial of his basic humanity. I've talked about many of his childhood experiences. You couldn't drink water in the school unless it was poured to you for the great height. If there was no one available, no peon there to pour it for you, you couldn't touch the tap. And if you did, you got beaten up, as happened to him. All of these things were just horrendous experiences. He was the first in his class, and normally the bright students sat in the front. He, because he was a Dalit, had to sit on a gunny sack in a corner, and he had to take the gunny sack home himself because none of the staff would touch it. I mean, all of these horrendous experiences. So for him, Hinduism was an oppressive religion, and he wanted to change that. Now, tactically, he also tried to work within the fold for a very long time. And though he expressed his dissatisfaction with Hinduism in the late 20s already, it was only as late as 1956 that he actually converted. In 1935, he made his famous statement, "I was born a Hindu, but I will not die one," but he still took 20 years to act on it. So in all fairness, one can say he gave Hinduism as many opportunities as possible to reform itself. And then by trying to bring in the Hindu Code Bill, for example, as a lawyer, he thought maybe that's one way of legislating change and bringing about change in society. The Constitution's outlawing of discrimination of untouchability, coupled with affirmative action for untouchables, was also partly made possible by the fact that the Dalits had stayed within the Hindu fold. So you can't just describe it as kind of a blanket rejection of Hinduism until the very end of his life, when he had become fairly bitter and disillusioned about some of these things and what he saw as the impossibility of change. He even dismissed our democracy in a notorious interview to the BBC a couple of years before he died. He said that democracy is impossible in India because our society is undemocratic, because of the caste system. Everything was seen through the prism of the caste system.
Right.
Now, on this question of Hindus and Hinduism, I think where he was surprisingly flawed was in his failure to see the extraordinary range and diversity of the faith, the existence of various ideas within Hinduism that made it not quite the Hinduism that he was always demonizing. And at the same time, for a man who was smart enough, for example, to sometimes buttress his arguments with relevant quotes from the Gita and so on, it was surprising that he spoke of Hindus and Hinduism so often in ways that didn't allow for this recognition of the nuances of the faith. And that I think is in some ways a flaw, because while we all understand, for Gandhiji famously said, Dr. Ambedkar's bitterness is totally understandable.
Yes.
In fact, it's a miracle that he doesn't want to break our heads.
That's correct. That's in as many words.
Yeah, actual words of Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah.
So given that his extreme expressions sometimes is understood. But having said that, it would have been nice if he had also acknowledged some of the other qualities and perhaps tried to, but even the sort of the RSS types are grateful for the fact that in the end the conversion was to Buddhism,
yes,
and not to a non-Indic faith.
Yes.
Because they felt that then that was almost like a a Catholic becoming a Protestant. It's okay. It's all part of the big, large family.
And they could still own him.
That's right. So they'd like to think anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. His conversion to Buddhism. Now, in your assessment, was it the surrender of a defeated revolutionary, or was it the last protest of a winning revolutionary or a victorious?
No, it was an intellectual journey that he made starting from his childhood. When Professor Keluskar, who met him in a garden reading his textbooks and was impressed with him and gave him his own life of the Buddha when Ambedkar was a teenager, from then onwards he'd been fascinated with the story of the Buddha and the values. It's interesting, even in the Constituent Assembly, though he had been inspired by the phrase liberty, equality, fraternity and the French Revolution, he was careful to trace the values of liberty, equality and fraternity to Indian history and the Buddhist Sanghas.
Yeah.
And he thought fraternity could be better sold to India and better understood in India as a Buddhist concept rather than as a French revolutionary concept.
Yes.
So no, he was intellectually very, very interested in Buddhism, and already for some years before his conversion, he used to attend there used to be international Buddhist conferences that took place in different countries. And I think he personally attended and spoke at the 2nd, 3rd and 5th. And the 5th was the one just before he converted. So you have a major intellectual engagement with the values and principles of Buddhism.
So really evolutionary change for him. The last flaw, again, his rage against Mahatma Gandhi. To the extent that when the Mahatma was assassinated, even your staunchest opponent would express sentiment about what happened. He was conspicuous by his silence. He never ever said anything about Mahatma Gandhi's assassination. And then, as you've written, that even 2 decades after the assassination.
No, not 2 decades, 5 years after.
5 years. Yeah, mid-50s, that's right, yes. About 7-8 years after his assassination, he still was very critical and openly critical of the Mahatma. So, was it only because of Mahatma Gandhi? He saw Mahatma Gandhi as a Hindu in disguise, and his advocacy of the Dalits as a political ploy, or was there more that was antithetical?
It was all of those things. He started off resenting the fact that Mahatma Gandhi presumed to speak for the Dalits. And Mahatma Gandhi said, I am the voice of the Harijans in the nationalist cause. And Ambedkar said, you can't be. You haven't experienced what we've experienced. I will speak. We Dalits must speak for ourselves. That was the first fundamental disagreement. Secondly, he didn't agree with the kind of what he saw as the patronizing attitude of Hindu reformists like Mahatma Gandhi. Even the term Harijan, for example, children of God. We're all children of God. Why should one set of people be patronized in this way? So there was a rejection all along. If you look at the various words that Ambedkar patronized before Dalit came into vogue, he would talk about the Mukh, the silent. He would talk about the Bahishkrit. He would talk about the depressed classes. He would even use the English word untouchable. Until, of course, from 1935 in the Government of India Act, the term scheduled castes came into use. But they never used the word Harijan and rejected it and resented it. He would say that this whole idea of having a Mahatma is wrong. And that partially goes back to his own reading of Kabir and Tukaram, whom his father had read to him when he was a child. He always had this feeling that, no one should be. In fact, Kabir has a famous doha that he quotes in which that Ambedkar used to like, saying that it's hard enough to be a man, how can you be a saint? That kind of thing. So he didn't like what he saw as Mahatma Gandhi's pretensions to sainthood, to being a great sage. And then there was this fundamental political argument on caste. Mahatma Gandhi said, I will not allow you to divide Hindus by having separate electorates. Ambedkar felt, and he was probably right in that sense, that if you're going to have mixed electorates, even if you reserve seats for Dalits, for the so-called depressed classes, but the majority of people voting for the representative are actually upper caste Hindus, then you'll only get somebody who's willing to please them rather than somebody who's the true voice of the community. And so he wanted Dalits to be able to vote for their own leaders. And that's something which, of course, was an irreparable breach between him and Gandhiji. The famous Pune Pact, Ambedkar surrendered.
Yes.
Because he was made to feel by everybody, including Gandhi, that if he didn't surrender, Gandhi would die. The fast unto death in 1932.
The Pune Pact.
And the Pune Pact came after that. And I think that defeat rankled. It was hailed as a big compromise. But within himself, he felt he had surrendered. And he also felt that eventually this undermined the cause of true Dalit representative.
Of course,
and then he ended up writing some very nasty books. What Gandhi and the Congress did to the untouchables and things like that. Very harsh, hostile things. When Louis Fisher, the famous American biographer of Gandhi, met him in 1946, he said, this is the man who hates Gandhi most in India, more than any Briton hates him.
Yes.
Then when Gandhiji was assassinated, as you said, he didn't say a word.
Right.
He did walk briefly in the funeral procession, stayed silent, left the procession, went back to his room. Some apologists have said that he actually went later, some years later or some months later, to Rajghat and sat there quietly and meditated over Gandhi's thing. But at the time of the death, he said nothing, never wrote anything. No one knows what his feelings were. But then in an interview, again, BBC interview in the 50s, 1953, I think it was, he said, people only saw him as a devotee, as devotees, and they worshipped him. I saw the man, I saw him bare his fangs. That kind of language, which was unnecessarily ungracious, because you can disagree and you can have fundamental, in fact, intellectually on many of his disagreements. We can support Ambedkar as today's realities attest. Ambedkar was probably right on overcoming village prejudices.
He certainly was right on that. Even separate electorates, possibly. I mean, it's hypothetical, but it's possibly he had the right approach.
But you can disagree without being so ungracious. Whereas Gandhiji kept right till the very end reaching out to Ambedkar saying, tell me what I can do to bring you into our cause. How can I accept? And he would always publicly praise Ambedkar's qualities and so on. So that, the contrast between the way in which Gandhiji spoke of him, even while they disagreed, and the way he spoke of Gandhiji, that again is the flaw that I think does him a little credit.
It's difficult to explain so much. Now, is it true that Mahatma Gandhi was largely responsible for getting him into Nehru's cabinet, for getting him the law minister's job?
I mean, we don't have a whole lot of evidence, but it's definitely clear that Gandhiji wanted it. And it's also clear that Nehru actually said we have to get Ambedkar into law. And I think some people also assume that it wasn't just Nehru's own desire, it was also that Nehru was strongly influenced by Gandhiji's wish that Ambedkar had to be in the cabinet. And he reserved law for Ambedkar.
Right. Also, again, it's not a flaw, but after having written all your life against Gandhi and even Nehru to some extent, to take their support to get into the Rajya Sabha, does it show a bit of an opportunism?
No, I think, frankly, in politics, the art of the possible, as the old cliche goes, he sadly fought and lost 2 elections in 52.
Yes.
An election and a by-election, and the only way he could have
One from Bombay, right?
Yeah. And the thing is that one he came second, the other he came third. Yes. So he knew that if he wanted to continue having a voice in national politics, it would have to be in the Rajya Sabha, and the Congress was so dominant, you basically needed the Congress's help to come in.
Yeah. So now, I come back to a little bit about his statism. What would if you look at the way India's federal structure has evolved under his very constitution, under his very authorship, in a sense. Now we have a broken federal polity today. I mean, you have the conflict over the National Investigating Agency. I mean, if the local police force is going to be overridden by the NIA, then a federal structure gets, the institution of the state governor. Of late, we've seen them so partisan that really they're not acting as neutral umpires at all. You also have now the crushing fiscal powers that the central government has over state governments. How would he have read these follies or these attacks or violations of his own constitution?
See, he's a man who reacted to the situations he saw, and he was normally very, very perspicacious and somewhat ahead of his time. The way in which, for example, he wrote about the Pakistan situation in 1940, 7 years before Pakistan was created. It was very perceptive and insightful. So I would argue that his own thinking would have changed, and we shouldn't only look at what he said about the realities of the 40s and 50s in judging what he would have said today. That doesn't do enough credit to his mind, which was an extremely supple and sharp mind. I think he would have reacted adversely to the political dominance that's being shown by the ruling party and the hollowing out of institutions. Ambedkar is somebody who would have valued enhancing the autonomy of those institutions that underpin our democracy. And I think that's something which sadly we are seeing hollowed out more and more by the present government. Secondly, I think he would have welcomed the fact that you have different state governments from different parties who therefore offer a reasonable check and balance to an overwhelmingly powerful central government. But at the same time, you're right, he would, for example, not have supported the Panchayati Raj amendments in the 1990s that gave us the extraordinary amount of power for village councils and so on. And he would certainly have deplored the actions of the so-called Khap Panchayats and other sort of what he would say as regressive caste-based bodies that are still trying to impose their wishes on people in northern India and in a very casteist way. So there's a lot that he would have continued to object to from what he saw in the past, but I think his thinking would have evolved to embrace some of the new political realities which were not there in his lifetime.
You've also interestingly called him conciliatory and a conformist as a constitution writer, while on the other hand, all his politics was about rebellion and was all about, very open, aggressive stance against...
there's no question that he knew how to accommodate those who disagreed with him in order to get along. Partially, he had to do that in working with the Brits, working in the Legislative Assembly, working in the Viceroy's Executive Council. So he'd already had the art of doing that very well. He was persuasive, effective speaker, but if he didn't persuade, he moved on. He knew which battles to fight. In fact, I can tell you that on the larger question of how the country should be organized, he had been in favor of the presidential system. But Nehru and others, and most of the Congress leaders, wanted to have that which the British had denied them, namely the British system, the parliamentary system of Westminster, and he gave in. And eventually he had to defend the choice before the Constituent Assembly, and he talked about accountability versus representation and so on, and finally plumped for the parliamentary system. But in his own discussions, he had been in favor of the presidential. So he knew how to conciliate and accommodate.
I've always flirted with this one, again, untested hypothesis, that he had much more of an American influence in his thinking compared to the Oxford, Cambridge strand of Nehru, Patel, Gandhi. He came, he spent a lot of time in America. Unlike Nehru, who, when he first time went to America, said, you should never come to America for the first time.
That's right.
So I flirted with that thought that a lot of his iconicalism came from American thought.
Good. I think it's a good insight because, he was there for 4 years at a very formative stage of his life. All the professors who influenced him most, including the philosopher John Dewey and some of the economists that he worked under, were all Americans. And I think he was quite influenced by that. By the time he got to England, many of his ideas had been formed and evolved. And it was interesting, at one point, after studying a bit in England, he wanted to go off to Germany after the First World War to study in the universities there. So he was interested in different schools of thought, but he was by no means an Anglophile the way in which Nehru was completely schooled in English education and English customs and thought.
When you talk about Germany, I just want to make a small digression. At one stage, he also spoke well of Mussolini. What was that context?
Well, don't forget, even Churchill spoke well of Mussolini. I mean, it was, frankly, at that point, particularly in the late 20s, there was a perception that Mussolini was getting a lot of things done to shake Italy out of its slumber. Didn't last very long. People realized the cruelties he was inflicting. By the 30s, I think it was clear there was not much good to be said for fascism. But in the 20s, a lot of people were attracted by both the regimentation, the discipline, the trains running on time, the famous cliche, all of that. But also, I think in the case of Ambedkar, Ataturk more than Mussolini, he wanted the idea of a strong leader who could ride roughshod over people's social prejudices. The way in which Ataturk really broke the back of Muslim conservatism in Turkey. He wanted to break the back of Hindu conservatism in India. And he thought it would take an Ataturk to do that. It would take a Mussolini to do that. It was always relating it to the realities of Dalits in India that led to that statement.
Right. So we've had such a marvelous conversation here. I'd like to open this to questions from the House. You've got Shashi here, and that's a great opportunity to engage with him. So let's get some questions going. Yeah, the first hand that I saw here. Yeah. Do you have a mic?
I think there are mics going around, right?
Do you have a mic there?
Yeah. Hello, good afternoon. I am Mihir. My question is, of course, Dr. Ambedkar was a champion of Dalit rights, of also the Hindu bills which he rallied for, and also the women rights. But is it only because he was not in a part of government, in the sense he didn't have to run the party, he didn't have to win the elections? Because when you are in that position, maybe there are many compromises to do. So was it only because he was outside he could champion those rights in the later parts? Is it the case?
No, Mir. First of all, he did have to run a party. In fact, he ran one party after another. His first party was in some ways his most successful, and that was the Independent Labour Party, which was more than a Dalit party. He wanted it to be a party of the Dalits and the working class. And in the Bombay presidency, they did very well in the elections of 1937. So that was, in fact, arguably his most successful party. But subsequently, when he formed other parties, he did much less well. And certainly, when he attempted to, when India became independent, remember in this first election, it was only for the presidency. So it was only for Bombay presidency that he was organized. Then he didn't do so well. But when you say that, he didn't really have to operate, he could afford to have these positions. Not true. He was taking positions that he wanted to see implemented across the country. Every position, one thing that Raghav and I have not talked about is his feminism. He was one of the earliest feminists in Indian thought. I mean, he, in the 20s and 30s, we should read some of his speeches to women. Remarkable. Telling women to stand up for their rights inside their marriages, to delay parental pressure to get married, to choose when to have children. He tried to bring in legislation permitting free access to birth control, which was actually defeated in the Bombay legislature, but he tried to do that. Wages for women laborers, he was able to pass that. He was somebody who was constantly standing up for women's rights, and he was addressing women and exhorting them to do that. That's a man who actually wanted practical change. He had ideas, but he wanted those ideas to work in reality. And on the Dalit thing, he really wanted the caste system to be annihilated. He felt it was the biggest evil holding India back. And that was something that was an intellectual conviction and also a political plan of action.
Right. Yeah, let me go to you behind there, and then I'll come to you, and then I'll come to you. So yeah, please.
A very simple question. I'm Priya.
The mic has to be closer to your mouth. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I'm Priya. Very straight question. If Ambedkar were alive today, would he have been a part of the Bharat Jodo Yatra?
I think that's an impossible question to answer. I would like to think so. It's interesting, as you know, that the Bharat Jodo Yatra has attracted non-Congress supporters of such great range, from Prashant Bhushan to Aditya Thackeray and people in between. So you've really got a large, wide political range of people who have come and expressed their support for the Bharat Jodo Yatra. So to that degree, Ambedkar might have gone along. But I'm afraid in his last decade or so, he had to go around with a stick like Raghav. So I'm not sure he could have walked very far or very fast.
We've probably done 2 kilometers, yes. Yeah, you go, let's go there, and then after that there, yeah. And then I'll come here. I think there was a question. Yes.
My question to you, Mr. Tharoor, is that in an essay titled by Dr. Ambedkar, where he wrote about Buddha and Marx, he said that the only way India can truly have socialism is through the way of what Buddha paved through. I want to know whether you agree to this. And the second is, Dr. Ambedkar also said that the sovereignty of the Hindu scriptures should be abolished for a modern India to be created. I want your views on both these. I haven't read your book, but I thought these were relevant.
Yeah, they're both mentioned in the book. I mean, on the question of Ambedkar and Marxism or communism, it's interesting. He was attracted to many Marxist ideas, but he rejected communism as a political ideology, partly because of its obsession with class rather than caste. And the communists and Ambedkar clashed in the 30s and 40s a lot. EMS Nambudripad, who became the first leader of one of the first major leaders of the Communist Party, actually criticized Ambedkar for trying to distract the fight against imperialism through talking about the uplift of Harijans. He said a banal issue like the cause of Harijans should not be allowed to distract from the big fight against imperialism. So the communists and Ambedkar were completely opposed to each other on their basic diagnosis of what is the important problem in Indian society, with one focusing on class issues and the other focusing on caste. And that was why I think for him, he found the virtues of democracy, socialism, and so on far more in Buddhist ideas of fraternity than he found in the Communist Party. That was the first question. Remind me what your second question was. Just briefly, shout out one word, it'll come back. Yeah, so on that, yeah, he had, that was a slightly bizarre, it was part of the statism that Raghav and I were decrying. He actually wanted the state, that is the government of India, to essentially take over control of Hindu theology, abolish all the scriptures that sanctified caste, and sort of create a new approved theology, which is a bizarre idea. And frankly, you know, religions are organic, they evolve in their own way. And of course, the great strength of Hinduism is the extremely wide range of doctrines that enable you to pick and choose what you believe in. Ambedkar famously burned the Manusmriti on Christmas Day in 1929, I think it was, 27. When he burned the Manusmriti, there would have been caste Hindus who would have said, we understand why he's doing it. He actually, 9 years later, in 1938, gave an interview where he explained, I was not saying there weren't any good things in the Manusmriti. I was not saying that Manu wasn't a great sociologist who understood the society of his time, but I was saying that because the Manusmriti sanctifies caste oppression, that's why we're burning it. That was the message he's trying to convey. So he would, for example, if he had been sitting on this state-sponsored body to rewrite Hindu theology, he would have taken good bits from everywhere, even from the Manusmriti, but he would have abolished everything that sanctified and supported Varnashram or caste. That was his thinking. But you can't have the state getting involved in religion like that. And I think that was, again, to my mind, a limitation of the realism of the lack, in this particular case, the lack of realism in Ambedkar's thinking.
So there's a question coming in from there. Yes, you've had it. And then I'll come to you, sir, right after this. Yeah.
Hello, sir. My name is Nikita. So you brought out a very beautiful point. You said that we're going from British ruling India in terms of communalism to Ambedkar coming forward and putting forward individualism. Now that is a very keen and beautiful point to make. But do you think today we have so many things in paper for individualism but nothing in practice? So how would he react to this dissolving individualism? This dissolving idea of individual not being able to cherish himself, his sexuality, his any type of philosophy?
I believe he would have stood up for individual rights, whether it's, as you say, on sexual matters, gender orientation matters, whether it's questions of political agency. He would have stood for the individual, but always within the context of appreciating the fraternity in society. So he would say, because we are all equal, every one of us has rights. And therefore, every one of us has the right to pursue our rights, provided we don't infringe on the rights of others. I think on that, Ambedkar actually was a classic liberal rather than just, you know, he would probably have called himself a socialist thinker, but he was very liberal in his thoughts in those regards. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think you would have found him unfriendly for any of the so-called woke causes of today. He would probably have been quite open. But at the same time, temperamentally, he could be quite testy and dismissive of movements or things he didn't like. I've got this episode in the book where he's quite dismissive of Dilip Kumar, the actor who came to meet him. I don't have patience for, and I'm not interested in the support of movie stars. That kind of attitude. So he also had this slightly curmudgeonly attitude to things for whatever reason he didn't have patience for. He had a short temper once in a while, and it was not always targeted in the fairest way. So I can't guarantee that he would have supported whatever cause you have in mind right now. But in principle, yeah, he was in favor of individual rights.
Okay, I'm going to come here. Yes, to the gentleman here.
Rahul Singh. I'd like to know two questions. One is, why weren't more Dalits converted to Buddhism? I think there are about 70 million Dalits, but he was able to convert only about 3 or 4 million. Number two, there's a story that's been going around that he wanted to convert his followers to Sikhism, but the Sikh leaders said, no, we don't want Dalits coming into our fold.
Not quite, Rahul. He actually did explore all the faiths. In fact, when he first made a statement in the 1930s, that famous or notorious statement, I was born a Hindu, but I assure you I will not die one, all the religious leaders reached out to him, including Hindu leaders, but Islam reached out, representatives of the Islamic faith, Christian faith, Sikh faith, Buddhists, everyone reached out to him. With Islam, his view was that there was still a persistence of discrimination, that Dalits who had converted to Islam were not, in his view, given a fair deal. When it came to Christianity, he saw many of the same flaws, but he also, I think, was troubled but the association of Christianity with the imperial rulers of that time. When it came to Sikhism, there was, again, this persistent problem of the sort of Mazhabi Sikhs versus the caste Sikhs and so on. And there was also a worry among some Sikh leaders, to that degree you're right, that if a faith of those days about 10 to 14 million Sikhs was suddenly swamped by 70 million Dalits, that Sikhism would no longer be recognizable as the same faith. It would suddenly be very different. And so that the scale of numbers would not be entirely welcome to some leaders in the Sikh community. So all of these things were being discussed and all options were examined. He took a long time over it. But as I mentioned earlier in the conversation with Raghav, intellectually he had always been much more attracted to Buddhism. He had been reading about Buddhism since he was a teenager. He was very, very struck by the life of the Buddha and the Dhamma. And his book, The Buddha and the Dhamma, is actually a very important contribution, which many Buddhist scholars reject, because it's so much more about Ambedkar, they say, than it is about the Buddha. But it's a profound understanding of the Dhamma as his, if you like, a political conviction of how a society should be. I mean, Buddha was about the right way of living, and that was very much something that appealed to Ambedkar. So I think at the end of the day, he did consider all of these things. Why didn't more convert? That I think you have to, because he passed away within 6 months of his conversion. And once he'd passed away, that motor, that engine wasn't necessary. In the ceremony that he converted, 500,000 people, at least 5 lakh were present and converted along with him. All sorts of people, including a former state chief justice, and all good. Everyone stood up and recited the 22 vows that he had propounded, and they all converted to Buddhism. But once he'd gone, perhaps that major engine was lacking, and very few others took the plunge. I think periodically a handful are doing, but most probably didn't see much point, especially since those who are arguing that Dalit rights were being reasserted within the Hindu fold, they began to gain more and more prominence in India, and there was no comparable voice to Ambedkar's arguing for continued conversion. So that's why I think it stopped where it stopped. There was no anti-Buddhist move in the country, there still isn't. But there is kind of, why bother, what difference does it make kind of feeling that many people had.
So one last question, Shashi, we'll do that. The lady right there at the back. You have the mic there? Yes.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. My name is Shivi. So I wanted to ask, in the contemporary India, how far has India come in terms of annihilation of caste, and what, had he been alive today, what would his perspective be on India today?
No, I don't think we've come at all far in annihilating caste. What Ambedkar wanted was to completely destroy the caste system. And he would probably have been horrified to realize that if anything, caste has become more entrenched, in that even political parties who are against discrimination or untouchability are still seeking votes in the name of caste, picking candidates depending on caste strength. That caste consciousness is actually greater today than it was even in the 1950s. Because now every caste is conscious of its identity, and that identity label has become a marker for political mobilization. All of those, Ambedkar and Nehru would both have been horrified. Both thought in different ways that caste would disappear. In the case of Nehru, he thought it would disappear because India would be modernized and that kind of thinking would disappear. In the case of Ambedkar, he fought for annihilation of caste because he felt that as long as there was a consciousness of the caste system, as long as Varnashrama existed, then the oppression of Dalits would also exist. And as I pointed out in the book, as we talk about the legacy and we discuss contemporary episodes, we still come across horrific episodes of discrimination against Dalits going on. So there's plenty to be appalled by, but there's also undoubtedly a persistence of the caste system in India's society and in India's politics that 100% Ambedkar would have disapproved of. I mean, even matrimonial pages mentioning caste, I mean, he would probably have wanted to outlaw that if he could. Yes. But I mean, the fact is that this is far from the vision of annihilation of caste that he talked about. We're nowhere there. All we can hope for today as reformist Hindus would be that caste becomes a benign label of identity, like an old school tie, or, I went to the school, or I played for that team, or that kind of thing, rather than something which becomes a sort of bristling badge of identity that can be directed against others. We haven't got there. We are far from it yet.
Right. So I'm sure all of you have many more questions. May I suggest a better way of getting your answer? Read the book, and then if you have a question, tag Shashi on Twitter or Instagram. You will get, you will get your answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raghav.
Thank you.
Oh.
Oh.
What's that? It's not really a question, but so there's never really been any evidence of class oppression in India before 700 AD. If you read the travels of Huin Sang and other travelers, you know, there has been no mention of that. So according to the scriptures, someone mentioned the scriptures, everyone is born a Shudra, and it's only by deeds that they, attain class. My father is a businessman, so it's natural that I would follow in his footsteps. I could be a carpenter, an actor, or whatever gave my choice. Conversely, there are people who have, attained, immense fame and fortune from very underprivileged backgrounds.
So what's your question? What's your question? Because we are under pressure to wrap up here. That's the problem.
No, so in Indian culture, there has never been any toilets, and people have to bury their waste, and it's only when invasive...
So what is the question?
No, I'm just giving some.
Oh, you're just giving some observations.
Some commentary.
You tweet Twitter. You tweet.
That's not totally accurate, but we can talk about that some other time.
You can have.
There were definite instances of discrimination, and there's a lot about the history of caste that Ambedkar himself wrote about in his first paper in 1916 in Columbia, where he talked about the origins of the caste system. And right towards the end of his life, he said caste really has nothing to do with religion. It's the way in which society is organized. But the problem with Hindu religion is that it sanctifies this form of social organization. So that's the... So he turned out to be seen as anti-Hindu because he was of a social analysis of caste discrimination.
That's the question that I'd asked.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Raghav.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Always a pleasure.